The wind across the Blackwood Ridge did not merely blow, it scarred, a relentless, invisible blade that had spent decades carving the soul out of the land, and by extension, the man who tended it. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his sprawling, weather-beaten ranch house, a structure that seemed to lean into the gale, as if apologizing for its own existence, much like its owner. At 52, Elias was a monument to solitude, a man composed of calloused hands, squinted eyes that had seen too many draughts, and a heart that had long ago calcified into something hard and unyielding, protected by layers of silence and routine. The ranch, once a bustling hub of laughter and livestock during his father's time, now felt like a graveyard of memories, where the only sounds were the lowing of cattle, the creaking of floorboards, and the perpetual howling of the wind that served as a constant reminder of everything he had lost: his parents to a fever that swept through the valley 20 years prior, his younger brother to a runaway horse, and any semblance of warmth or companionship to the slow, grinding erosion of grief. He was known in the nearest town, a dusty speck on the map called Oakhaven, as the ghost of Blackwood, a man who paid his bills in cash, spoke in grunts, and whose reputation for bitterness was so well established that even the stray dogs gave his property a wide berth. Today, however, the rhythm of his desolate life was about to be shattered, not by a storm or a financial ruin, but by a knock at the door that sounded timid, almost apologetic, against the heavy oak. When Elias finally dragged himself from his reverie, his boots heavy on the wood, and swung the door open, he expected to see a salesman, a debt collector, or perhaps a neighbor seeking help with a fence line. Instead, he found a young woman standing in the swirling dust, her clothes ragged and stained with the mud of a long journey, her hair a tangled mess of dark curls matted against a face that was bruised, smudged with dirt, and turned downward in a posture of profound shame. She clutched a small, frayed bundle to her chest as if it were the last remaining piece of her soul, and she trembled, not just from the biting cold of the high plains, but from a terror that ran deeper than the chill. Elias frowned, his brow furrowing into deep trenches of suspicion, ready to slam the door and retreat into his fortress of one. But something in the way she held herself, the sheer desperation radiating from her small frame, stayed his hand. "Can I help you?" he growled, his voice rusty from disuse, lacking any softness, purely functional. The girl flinched at the sound, her shoulders hunching further, and she took a half step back, her eyes darting toward the muddy track behind her, as if expecting a monster to emerge from the haze. I didn't mean to trouble you, sir," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the wind, thin and brittle like dry grass. "I saw the smoke from your chimney. I needed a moment." Elias crossed his arms over his broad chest, blocking the doorway physically if not verbally. "Moment's over. Move along. Nothing here for you." It was his standard dismissal, a shield he had perfected over 2 decades, designed to keep the world at bay and his pain contained within these 4 walls. But the girl did not move. Instead, she dropped to her knees in the dirt, the mud soaking instantly into her tattered skirt, and she bowed her head so low her forehead nearly touched the ground. "Please, sir," she whispered, the words tearing out of her with a raw vulnerability that struck Elias with a force he hadn't anticipated. "I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook." The sentence hung in the air, absurd and heartbreaking all at once, cutting through the noise of the wind and settling heavily in the space between them. Elias stared down at her, confused by the specific nature of her plea. In his experience, people begged for money, for water, for shelter, for mercy. They did not bargain with their culinary skills while declaring their own lack of beauty, as if it were a defect needing apology. He looked at her again, really looked at her, past the dirt and the bruises, and saw not a threat, but a broken thing, much like the old rocking chair on his porch that he kept meaning to fix but never did. There was no guile in her posture, no trickery, only a desperate offering of the only skill she believed held value. A strange, forgotten sensation stirred in the depths of his chest, a faint thumping that felt alien after so many years of stillness. With a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire stature, Elias stepped aside, holding the door open just wide enough for her to slip through. "Get up," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Don't track too much mud, and don't expect a feast." The girl scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and gratitude, and she hurried inside, clutching her bundle as if it contained gold. As Elias closed the door against the howling wind, sealing them in the dim, quiet interior of the house, he realized with a jolt of unease that the silence he had cherished for so long suddenly felt different, charged with an unknown variable, a presence that threatened to disrupt the careful order of his isolation. He watched as she stood awkwardly in the center of his living room, dripping mud onto the worn rug, looking around with awe at the simple furnishings as if she had entered a palace. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone still gruff but lacking the earlier edge of hostility. "Alara," she whispered, finally lifting her head to meet his eyes. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, bright and clear despite the grime surrounding them, filled with an intelligence and a sadness that mirrored his own, though hers was fresh and raw while his was ancient and settled. "Alara," he repeated, testing the weight of it. "Well, Alara, you said you can cook. Prove it. The pantry is through there. There's beans, some salted pork that's been sitting since last winter, and flour that might still be good if the mice haven't gotten to it. Make something edible, or you're out before sundown." It was a test, a cruel one perhaps, but Elias needed to know if this was a scam, if she was merely using a sob story to gain entry before robbing him blind. But Alara didn't hesitate. She nodded vigorously, a spark igniting in those green eyes, and she moved toward the kitchen with a sudden burst of energy, her previous trembling replaced by a focused determination. Elias watched her go, leaning against the doorframe, his arms still crossed, waiting for the sound of failure, for the clatter of pots and the smell of burning food that would justify ejecting her back into the storm. Instead, what followed was a symphony of efficiency. He heard the swift chopping of a knife, the sizzle of fat hitting a hot pan, the rhythmic stirring of a pot, sounds that had not echoed in this house since his mother died. The air, usually stale and smelling of dust and old tobacco, began to change, slowly filling with aromas that triggered dormant memories in the deepest recesses of Elias's mind: the scent of frying onions, the earthy richness of simmering beans, the warm, yeasty promise of bread rising. He found himself drifting toward the kitchen, drawn by a gravitational pull he couldn't resist, peering around the corner to see Alara moving with a grace that belayed her exhaustion. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth from her bundle, rolled up her sleeves to reveal thin, scarred arms, and was working with a fervor that transformed the dingy kitchen into a place of purpose. She wasn't just throwing ingredients together. She was coaxing flavor out of scarcity, treating the meager supplies with a reverence that made Elias feel ashamed of his own neglect. She hummed a soft, wordless tune as she worked, a melody that wove through the crackling of the fire and the bubbling of the stew, creating an atmosphere of domestic peace that felt so foreign to Elias that he almost wanted to run away from it. But he stayed, rooted to the spot, watching as this stranger, who had claimed she wasn't pretty, brought a kind of beauty into his home that had nothing to do with facial features and everything to do with the alchemy of care and survival. When she finally turned to him, holding out a bowl of steaming stew and a chunk of golden, brown bread she had somehow managed to bake in the cast iron skillet, Elias felt a lump form in his throat, an emotion so potent it threatened to choke him. "It's not much, sir," she said softly, echoing her earlier words, but there was a pride in her voice now, a quiet confidence in her craft. "But it's hot." Elias took the bowl, his rough hands trembling slightly as they brushed against hers, and he looked down at the food. It smelled like home, a concept he had thought dead and buried. He took a spoonful, blew on it gently, and tasted it. The flavors exploded on his tongue, rich and complex, transforming the cheap beans and tough pork into a meal fit for a king, seasoned with herbs he didn't know he had, and a love he hadn't realized he was starving for. He ate in silence, devouring the food with a hunger that went beyond the physical, while Alara watched him anxiously, wringing her hands in her apron. When he finished, he set the bowl down and looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 20 years, the ghost of Blackwood Ridge felt a tear prick the corner of his eye. "It's good," he rasped, his voice thick. "Better than good." Alara's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entirely, washing away the dirt and the bruises, making her radiant in a way that defied her own assessment of herself. "Thank you, sir," she breathed. "You can stay," Elias said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, before his brain could formulate the arguments against it. "Just for tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." And as the wind continued to rage outside, battering the walls of the lonely ranch house, inside, for the first time in an eternity, the heart of the lonely rancher beat once more, slow and steady, sensing with the rhythm of a stranger's kindness. The days that followed Alara's arrival were a study in contrasts, a slow-motion collision between the rigid, frozen world Elias had constructed and the fluid, vibrant life force that Alara embodied. The first part of this new chapter in Elias's life was defined by the tentative dance of coexistence, a period where both parties navigated the minefield of trust and trauma with cautious steps. Elias, accustomed to the absolute control of his solitary existence, found himself unsettled by the subtle shifts in his environment. The house, once a museum of stagnation, began to breathe again. Dust motes danced in sunbeams that pierced through windows. Elara insisted on opening every morning, despite the chill, claiming the house needed to let out the sad air. She cleaned with a ferocity that bordered on the miraculous, scrubbing floors until the wood gleamed, polishing silverware that hadn't seen light in years, and airing out quilts that smelled of lavender and sunshine instead of mothballs and decay. Yet, beneath this domestic renovation lay a current of tension. Elias was a man of few words, and Elara, sensing his fragility, often matched his silence, speaking only when necessary, her movements quiet and respectful. She slept on the couch in the living room, refusing the guest bedroom until Elias explicitly ordered her to take it, citing the draftiness of the main room as a health hazard. She cooked meals that were simple yet extraordinary, stretching their limited provisions with a creativity that amazed Elias, turning leftover biscuits into dumplings and tough cuts of meat into tender stews that warmed the bone. But the question of her past remained a looming shadow, an elephant in the room that neither dared to address directly. Elias knew better than to pry. He had learned long ago that everyone carried scars, and digging into them usually only caused more bleeding. However, his curiosity gnawed at him. Who was this girl who claimed she wasn't pretty? Who had beaten her, leaving those fading bruises on her arms and the haunted look in her eyes? Why had she chosen his ranch, of all places, a destination known for its inhospitable owner? These questions swirled in his mind as he went about his daily chores, fixing fences, checking the cattle, and maintaining the machinery, tasks that now felt different with the knowledge that someone was waiting for him back at the house, someone who cared whether he returned safe and sound. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, Elias returned from the fields to find Elara in the garden, a small patch of earth near the back porch that had been overrun with weeds for a decade. She was on her knees, her hands deep in the soil, pulling Thatsa with a determined rhythm. She looked up as he approached, wiping sweat from her brow, her face flushed with exertion. "I hope you don't mind, sir," she said, her voice tentative. "I thought maybe we could plant some vegetables. Spring is coming, and the soil looks rich if we work it." Elias stared at the patch of dirt, then at her dirty hands, and felt a surge of something akin to hope, a dangerous emotion he had suppressed for years. "Go ahead," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Just don't expect me to help." But he did help. The next day, he found himself beside her in the garden, his large, calloused hands breaking up the hard, packed earth while she sorted seeds and planned rows. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of shovels and the distant lowing of cattle. It was during this work that the second part of their evolving dynamic began to unfold, the slow erosion of barriers. As they worked side by side, the silence between them became less awkward and more comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Elias found himself talking, little snippets of conversation at first, comments about the weather or the condition of the soil, but gradually, the dam began to crack. He told her about the drought of '98, about how his father had taught him to read the clouds, about the stubbornness of the mule they used to own. Elara listened intently, her eyes fixed on him, validating his stories with nods and small smiles, making him feel heard in a way he hadn't in decades. In return, she began to share fragments of her own story, dropping them like breadcrumbs, testing the waters to see if he would reject her. She spoke of a life in the city, of a factory job that had paid pennies and demanded everything, of a landlord who viewed tenants as disposable, of a boyfriend who had promised the world and delivered only violence. She didn't go into graphic detail, but the pain in her voice was palpable, a raw wound that she was slowly beginning to expose to the air. "He used to tell me I was ugly," she confessed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "That no one else would ever want me, that I was lucky he tolerated me. So when I ran, I thought if I could offer something useful, like cooking, maybe someone would let me stay, even if I'm not pretty." Elias felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, directed at a man he had never met, a protective instinct roaring to life within him. He turned to look at her, seeing not the ragged refugee who had knocked on his door, but a woman of immense strength and resilience. "You listen to me, Elara," he said, his voice low and intense, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Whoever told you that was a fool. Blind and stupid. Beauty ain't about symmetry or smooth skin. It's about what's in here." He tapped his chest, right over his heart. "And you got more beauty in your little finger than most folks have in their whole bodies. You saved this old house. You saved me, whether you know it or not." Elara's eyes widened, filling with tears that spilled over, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't speak, unable to find words for the validation she had craved for so long, but the look she gave him was worth more than any speech. From that night on, the dynamic shifted irrevocably. The third part of this phase was the blossoming of a genuine partnership. Alara stopped calling him sir, unless she was teasing, switching to Elias, a name that sounded strange and wonderful on her lips. Elias, in turn, stopped treating her like a temporary guest and started treating her like family. He taught her how to ride the gentle mare, showing her the vast expanse of the ranch, pointing out the landmarks and the hidden springs. She taught him how to bake sourdough bread, how to make jam from the wild berries growing near the creek, and how to laugh again, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that eventually became frequent. They fell into a rhythm, a symbiotic relationship, where his strength protected her peace, and her warmth thawed his ice. The ranch began to flourish under their joint stewardship. The garden produced an abundance of vegetables, the chickens Alara convinced him to buy laid eggs daily, and the house was filled with the smells of baking and brewing. Neighbors from Oakhaven, who had avoided the property for years, began to stop by, drawn by the sight of smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney, and the rumor that the ghost of Blackwood had softened. They were greeted not with a grunt and a slammed door, but with a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, courtesy of Alara. Elias watched these interactions with a mix of pride and wonder, realizing that his isolation had been a choice, a prison he had built for himself, and that Alara had picked the lock without even trying. But the past is rarely content to stay buried, and as their present grew brighter, the shadows of Alara's history began to lengthen, threatening to encroach on their sanctuary. Rumors reached Elias in town, whispers of a man looking for a runaway girl, descriptions that matched Alara's former tormentor. The fear returned to Alara's eyes, a flicker of the terror she had arrived with, and she began to jump at loud noises, checking the locks on the doors repeatedly. Elias saw the change in her, the tightening of her shoulders, the way she scanned the horizon as if expecting an army to appear. He knew then that the honeymoon phase of their arrangement was over, and the real test of their bond was about to begin. He couldn't just be a beneficiary of her kindness anymore. He had to be her shield, her defender, the wall between her and the monsters of her past. The realization solidified his resolve, turning the faint heartbeat he had felt that first night into a thunderous drum of purpose. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a man with something to lose, something precious to protect. The tranquility of the ranch was about to be challenged, but Elias was ready. For the first time in his life, he had a reason to fight, not just survive. The storm that broke over Blackwood Ridge was not merely meteorological. It was a convergence of atmospheric pressure and human malice, a tempest that mirrored the turmoil brewing within the hearts of its inhabitants. It started with a drop in temperature, a sudden, sharp bite in the air that signaled the arrival of a late-season blizzard, the kind that could bury a man alive if he lost his way. But alongside the dropping mercury came the arrival of strangers. 3 men on horseback, clad in heavy dusters and wide-brimmed hats pulled low, rode up the driveway just as the first flakes began to swirl in the twilight. Elias saw them from the window, his hand instinctively going to the rifle rack above the fireplace, a weapon he hadn't touched in anger for 20 years. Beside him, Alara froze, her face draining of color, her hands clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling with a conjure that vibrated through the room. "I know it's him." Elias turned to her, his expression grim but resolute. He placed a large, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay in the back room," he commanded softly. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I say so." Alara hesitated, her eyes pleading, but one look at Elias's face, a mask of steely determination, convinced her. She nodded once, grabbed a kitchen knife more out of habit than hope, and retreated to the bedroom, sliding the bolt home with a click that sounded deafening in the sudden silence. Elias checked the rifle, the action smooth and practiced, a relic of a violent past he hoped never to revisit. He stepped out onto the porch just as the 3 riders reined in their horses, the snow already accumulating on their shoulders. The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek and eyes that held the cold cruelty of a predator, dismounted and strode toward the house, flanked by his 2 henchmen. "Evening," the leader called out, his voice slick and false, carrying easily over the rising wind. "We're looking for a girl. Runs by the name of Alara. Stole some things from us. Ran off without paying her debts." Elias stood his ground, the rifle held loosely at his side but ready. "No girls here," he stated flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Just me and my dogs." The leader laughed, a harsh, barking sound that was swallowed by the wind. "Don't play dumb, old-timer. We tracked her this far. Saw the smoke, saw the lights. She's in there. Hand her over. And we won't cause any trouble. Keep her, and things might get messy. Elias felt a cold rage settle in his gut, a clarity that sharpened his senses. This was the moment where the lonely rancher either faded away completely or rose to become something more. He thought of Alara, of her hands in the garden, of the smell of her bread, of the way she had looked at him when he told her she was beautiful. He thought of the silence he had lived in for so long, and how loud his heart was beating now. She ain't going nowhere with you, Elias said, raising the rifle and leveling it at the leader's chest. And if you take one step closer to this house, you'll be eating lead before you hit the porch. The leader's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of anger. You think you can stop us? There's 3 of us and one of you. You're an old man playing cowboy. Maybe, Elias replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. But I'm an old man who knows this land, and I'm an old man who has nothing left to lose. You want her? You gotta go through me. The standoff stretched, tense and fragile, the snow falling heavier now, obscuring vision and muffling sound. The leader studied Elias, weighing the risk, seeing the absolute conviction in the rancher's eyes. He knew a bluff when he saw one, and this wasn't it. But pride and greed are powerful motivators. Get him, the leader snarled to his men. The 2 henchmen moved forward, reaching for their own guns, but they had underestimated the terrain and the defender. Elias didn't wait. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing like thunder, startling the horses. The animals reared and panicked, throwing the henchmen off balance. In the chaos, Elias moved with a speed that belied his age, diving behind a stack of firewood as return shots rang out, splintering the porch railing. The blizzard intensified, reducing visibility to a few feet, turning the world into a white blur. Elias used the cover of the storm, moving silently along the side of the house, using his knowledge of every shadow and contour of his property. He was no longer fighting for survival, he was fighting for a future. He circled around, flanking the intruders who were now shouting in confusion, blinded by the snow and the darkness. One by one, he dismantled their assault, not with lethal force, but with precise disabling shots that took out their weapons and scared their horses senseless. The leader, realizing his plan was crumbling, tried to make a run for the front door, desperate to grab Alara and flee. But Elias was waiting. As the man lunged for the handle, Elias stepped out of the shadows, the barrel of the rifle pressing firmly against the leader's chest. I told you, Elias growled, his voice cutting through the wind. She stays. The leader looked into Elias's eyes and saw something terrifying, a man who had found his soul again, and who would burn the world down to protect it. Defeated and outnumbered by the elements and the rancher's resolve, the leader spat on the ground and backed away. This isn't over, he threatened weakly. It is for you, Elias countered. Get off my land. If I ever see your face within 10 miles of here again, I won't miss. The trio scrambled onto their spooked horses and galloped away into the blinding snow, disappearing into the white void as quickly as they had arrived. Elias stood on the porch for a long moment, watching them go, the rifle still in his hands, the cold numbing his fingers. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon and turned back to the house. He walked to the bedroom door and knocked softly. Alara, he called. It's over. They're gone. The door opened, and Alara threw herself into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with the release of tension and fear. Elias held her tight, wrapping his arms around her, shielding her from the cold and the memory of the threat. You're safe, he murmured into her hair. You're safe now. I promise. They stood there in the hallway, the storm raging outside, but inside, the warmth was absolute. The battle had been won not just against the intruders, but against the loneliness that had plagued Elias for so long. He had fought for someone else, and in doing so, he had saved himself. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into a new normal, one forged in the fires of adversity. The threat of the past lingered, but it no longer held power over them. Elias reinforced the fences, installed better locks, and made it known in Oak Haven that anyone bothering the residents of Blackwood Ridge would answer to him. Alara, emboldened by Elias's defense of her, began to shed the last of her insecurity. She planted more gardens, expanded the chicken coop, and even started teaching the local children how to bake, becoming a beloved figure in the community. The title she had given herself, I Ain't Pretty, was erased, rewritten by the way the townspeople looked at her, with respect and admiration, and by the way Elias looked at her, with a love that deepened with every passing day. One evening, months later, they sat on the porch again, watching the stars emerge over the ridge. The air was crisp, but not cold, carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers. Elora leaned her head on Elias's shoulder, a gesture that had become natural and comforting. "You know," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I still can't believe you took me in." A stranger, broken and scared. Elias chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "Best decision I ever made. You brought life back to this place, Elara. You brought life back to me." She smiled, looking up at him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. "And you gave me a home. You showed me that I'm worth something." "You were always worth something," Elias corrected gently. "You just needed someone to show you, just like I needed someone to remind me how to live." They sat in silence for a while longer, listening to the crickets and the gentle breeze, two souls who had found each other in the vast, empty landscape of their respective loneliness. The ranch was no longer a graveyard of memories. It was a sanctuary, a testament to the power of second chances and the healing nature of connection. The wind still blew across the Blackwood Ridge, but it no longer scarred. It sang a melody of freedom and hope, and in the heart of the lonely rancher, the beat was strong and steady, a rhythm of love that would echo forever. The story of the girl who whispered she wasn't pretty but could cook had become the legend of the ranch that came alive again, a tale told in Oak Haven for generations, reminding everyone that sometimes the simplest offerings can unlock the most profound transformations. Elias Thorne was no longer the ghost of Blackwood. He was a father, a partner, a man fully alive. And Elara was no longer a runaway hiding in the shadows. She was the heart of the home, the light in the darkness, the proof that beauty is found in the acts of love and the courage to start over. As the night deepened, they went inside, closing the door against the world, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms came next, they would face them together, hand in hand, hearts beating as one. The script of their lives had changed, the genre shifting from tragedy to romance, from isolation to community, and the final scene was not an ending, but a beginning, a promise of tomorrows filled with warmth, laughter, and the enduring aroma of home, cooked meals shared in love. The ranch stood tall against the skyline, a beacon in the darkness, declaring to the world that no heart is too broken to be mended, and no life is too lonely to be filled with joy, provided one is brave enough to open the door.